to record that, then do we have access to? It's Sam. Hi.
Hey, how's it
Are you
going?
ready for your debut? How's it going?
Not too bad.
Yeah.
Alright.
There's Bernie. He's over there eating chips.
What's up, Bree?
Hey, Ange.
Hey, Angie.
Hello. I think Mr. Cutler's on his way in. I'm gonna make you host.
Okay. I was emailing with Amy. Is the best way just for me when I'm done with my quick intro to just make her a host so then she can share a screen and stuff like that?
Okay. So do you know how to make her a host?
I think I just I can just click on her name.
Yeah, so you're just gonna click her name and then there's like there's a more button. Yeah,
Yep. Okay.
and you'll just do that. So now you're the host.
Awesome.
How are things? You'll have to call us and tell us how things are. All right.
You're good
I got
right now,
another-
yeah.
I got another little interview like thing for you on tomorrow. I have to call.
Okay.
So we're gonna kind of sit in here and share. I'll probably turn my camera off in a bit here.
Okay.
Are y'all ready?
Yeah.
You can bring your slides up probably. You want to do that?
Share my screen or
Yep, you just share your screen now that you're the host. You should be able to share screen.
can you see that?
Yep, you just had to put it in the presenter mode and then you can, yeah.
All right.
And then you just hit escape when you want to come out of that, or there's a stop share.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I just can't see you guys, but that's all right, I guess.
Yep, that's okay. So if you do the like little thumbnail thing, the second one in, you should be able to see who's ever there.
Okay.
And then it looks like we're getting more people coming on, so I'm gonna mute myself and
Sounds good.
thank you, Sam.
Yeah. All right. More and more people are rolling in, so we're gonna give them probably a couple minutes till after when this webinar was supposed to start, just so we can give everybody a fair opportunity to get in before we get started. So we'll give it another probably 2 or 3 minutes. We'll give it another minute, just in the interest of everybody's time, to be respectful of everyone's time. So after that minute, then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So I want to thank you all for being here. My name is Sam Schutte. I am a community education and program specialist with the Addiction Resource Council. That is who is hosting this webinar. This is going to be part of a thing we're going to do a couple times a year, a part of our community talks series. We're going to start conducting these webinars probably about once every quarter. And today we're talking about cannabis. The title of this presentation is The Cannabis Craze, Exploring Recent Trends in THC Products. We do have a guest speaker. So our guest speaker is Amy Miles. So Amy is the Director of Forensic Toxicology at the Wisconsin State Lab of Hygiene. That's part of the UW's Madison School of Medicine and Public Health. So she's got over 20 years of experience, giving hundreds of different presentations, covering a wide range of topics, all different sorts of substances, all that kind of stuff, and received several awards throughout her career. So she's definitely knows what she's talking about. And we're excited to have her giving us the talk that she's going to give. So just quickly, I'll give a quick overview, and then I'll pretty much hand it over, and we'll do questions on all that kind of stuff at the end. But what's going to be covered today is she's going to go into kind of a brief overview of what forensic toxicology is, what her job is, what she does. And then we're going to kind of dig into cannabis itself and pretty much the two main cannabinoids that most people are familiar with, which is CBD and then THC. But then also we have these new things coming out called THC isomers, and she'll talk a lot about that as well. So quickly, I want to put a plug in that we will be sending out a survey.
We lost your audio, Sam.
And all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to quit sharing my screen, and then I'm going to make Amy a host so that she can share her screen. Make host. Yes. Okay, Amy, you should be able to share your screen now.
All right. Hang on 1 second here. Oh, I love Zoom and I don't. Are you still just seeing the the Zoom screen, or are you seeing my slides?
No, we see your slides.
Perfect. And are we good now?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you taking some time with me today. As Sam mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about just what is forensic toxicology, just so you have an idea of where I'm coming from when I talk about a lot of the topics we're going to discuss today. We are here to serve a purpose for the state of Wisconsin. We deal mostly in legal situations where it's like the medical legal use of toxicology. So whether that's medical examiner death investigations or impaired driving, that's what toxicology really does. We measure what's in somebody's system, but we don't actually measure impairment. And that seems to always be a question, especially around, for alcohol, we have this number, we have this legal limit or this per se limit, and everybody always wants to know sort of where things are in relation to that. When we talk about especially drugs and forensic toxicology, we're really limited in that we can't necessarily talk about impairment, but we can talk about mechanism of action, what the drug does to the body, what the body does to the drug, to give some idea of what to expect in terms of impairment. But it's actually really difficult because everybody is so different. Here at the Wisconsin State Laboratory of Hygiene, we are separate from any sort of legal or judicial system. We work underneath the umbrella of the University of Wisconsin. We're actually within the School of Medicine and Public Health, which really helps us in terms of research and being completely unbiased. We do about 20,000 cases a year just in our shop alone. So that gives you some idea of just how busy we are. We actually are the busiest laboratory in the country that does this type of work. We mostly do impaired driving cases. And so of that 20,000, I'd say roughly 10% are medical examiner cases. So for our DUID or driving under the influence of drugs casework, we receive the samples, we do the testing, and then we interpret results, whether it's for the individual or the defense attorney or the prosecution or the judge, whomever's asking, and we testify in court all over the state. We usually testify in about 370 cases a year. And again, that is every county in the state is represented there. Medical examiner casework is a little bit different. It's similar to our impaired driving casework, but then in terms of testimony and things like that, we kind of funnel all that through the forensic pathologist and the medical examiner. So we just are one small piece of that larger investigation of, was this a fatal overdose caused by drugs? If so, what drugs were there? What would we expect for therapeutic? It's really important. Again, we are the only lab in the country that exists in this manner, in that we are a forensic entity within a public health lab that's within a university. So it really gives us a very different lens. We don't look at our work as a way to support law enforcement or support some sort of charge for adjudication. We really find ourselves as more of, we're doing this testing so this individual could hopefully be better addressed and assessed, instead of the focus being on the judicial system. We really are more about that public health part of drug testing and alcohol testing. Before we get any further, I also just want to mention some caveats. We do the best we can to test for all drugs that are in existence, but it's really difficult. We really do see drug as this revolving door. I would say every quarter, we're seeing what we call new or novel psychoactive substances or NPS drugs. And as we move through changes in laws and different acts within the country, we also find that that really tends to change our landscape, which is kind of the focus of today. Is now, you know, what we're dealing with today with the CBD and the THC isomers is really a reaction to when they revamped or opened up that Farm Bill Act a few years ago and made some changes there. So it's always, there's always a consequence when we make changes to certain bills, and I don't know that anybody could have really predicted this one. Instrumentation, our lab has pretty state-of-the-art instrumentation here. We can detect a lot of different substances. It's well over 1,000 different drugs. But even with that state-of-the-art system that we have, there are still drugs out there that elude us and we're not able to detect them, but we do a pretty good job. A lot of our focus, because we are within the university, is education and resource-based. So we do a lot of training, not just in the state, but all over the country. And, you know, trainings like this, where, you know, our group today may seem a little bit outside of that forensic toxicology bubble, but we find that partnerships are really important. And so training and education, especially for people that maybe they just aren't within that initial judicial system, but they're within, you know, whether it's behavioral health or assessment, drug and alcohol use and abuse, things like that. We feel that it's really important because we have a lot of information about drugs and alcohol that as much as we can share, we try to do that. Keep in mind, it's not always just alcohol. A lot of our work historically just really pivoted around alcohol, and it really mattered as to what was the blood alcohol concentration, and if it's above a certain threshold, we're not going to bother with anything else because it meets this adjudication or this charging of a legal limit requirement. So we try really hard to do all of the testing in all of the cases, but we simply don't have the resources to do it on all 20,000 cases. So there are some limitations, but when we do perform all of the testing, it is rarely just an alcohol case anymore. So what you're looking at here are the top 20 drugs from last year that we saw in our impaired driving casework. And what's been really interesting over the last 5 years or so has been watching some of these trends. Alcohol is always the most common, and then right behind that is THC. And even though we are not a decriminalized or legal state for THC, we have always consistently had it as our most common drug. Right now, we have about 1,800 cases in backlog. So that tells you THC is just this forever popular, really common drug that we see in our impaired drivers, and it's usually paired with alcohol. The other trends that you see there, methamphetamine and fentanyl, those are actually often in combination now. We kind of call that the new speedball. So that's where it used to be heroin and cocaine. Now it's fentanyl and methamphetamine, and it's a mixture instead of taking them separately. And then the rest of the drugs that you see there are a combination of either those novel psychoactive substances that I mentioned before, so things that are not available by prescription, they're not scheduled in the United States, so people are buying them off the internet, or they're a prescription medication. And a lot of what we see in our impaired drivers are due to prescription medications, because often people either don't know that they're impaired by them, or don't know that they shouldn't be combining them with alcohol or other substances. So for today, we're just going to focus in on what we've been seeing with CBD, THC, and those THC isomers, because those are really what are readily available to the public. And now that Illinois and Michigan, which includes the Upper Peninsula, so kind of our neighboring sandwiched states, are legal with THC, we're seeing a lot more THC use, and we're seeing a lot more of these isomers popping up. So we'll talk about those today. And then also just some of the challenges that we're seeing here when we're trying to stay on top of these isomers and try to be able to detect them. So with cannabis, Our first challenge is usually just detection. We know that operating a motor vehicle can be greatly affected by cannabis or THC. And we'll talk about the isomers and how those play into that shortly here. But one of our challenges with law enforcement is just getting them to understand that it's not just alcohol, and that if you have an individual that has an ignition interlock device in their car, so that's that breath testing device that people have to blow into if they've been charged with one, if they also are having a polysubstance issue with whether it's THC or some other substance, that ignition interlock device isn't going to help. Maybe it will curb the alcohol use, but it's not going to address the other issues that that individual may be dealing with. So we just want to make sure law enforcement understands what to look for when somebody is impaired by cannabis and other things. And then understanding the statute. We actually have a law right now in Wisconsin where any amount of Delta-9 THC, and we'll talk about what that means, any amount of that compound is a violation of the law. So because THC is illegal, you shouldn't use it, shouldn't possess it in Wisconsin. That law was drafted almost 20 years ago to deal with THC and impaired driving. We also know that a lot of the products that we'll touch on here in a little bit that people are purchasing, whether it's online or at a store somewhere, contain things other than what are said to be in that product, like synthetic cannabinoids. So we've been watching this trend for a number of years now, and we've actually known about synthetic cannabinoids for a few decades and have paid attention to their evolution. And so we know their effects on human performance, and we're very careful to see as these products come out that more and more of them are being adulterated with things other than cannabis, which includes synthetic cannabinoids. And then finally, CBD and hemp products. I'm sure you have seen a store somewhere, whether it's your neighborhood or just down the street, that is selling some sort of CBD hemp product. Now it's Delta-8, Delta-9. And the challenges here are legally, when we look at these products, what they're supposed to have in them, but what actually ends up being in them are not the same thing. So helping consumers to understand. Analytically, we have great testing capabilities here to be able to test for THC, because again, it is that drug of choice that we've seen for my entire career for drivers. We also know, though, I just told you about that pretty big backlog that we have. It takes us a while to get through all of those samples and get those reports out to everyone. And then we also struggle a lot with, if you're a heavy or maybe a newer user, so chronic versus novice, we see some pretty big challenges there, especially in adolescence, where we just don't quite understand the full impact of THC use in adolescence. But we do see a very different effect profile in adolescence. So kind of juggling all these things comes into play when we're looking at these cases. THC use has really changed through my career, where it used to mainly be smoked. Now we've got oral, so that includes things like gummy bears and chocolate bars and all those other things that you can purchase in the states where it's legalized. So that route of administration will change the profile of what we see when we test for it, which we'll talk about here in just a second. Obviously, they're smoked. Again, that's probably the classic way that we've always ever thought of for THC. Vaping. Our lab was involved, it was probably 4 years ago, in we call it EVALI, which was essentially the lung injury issue that people were seeing in vaping. And it turned out that it was adulterated THC vape cartridges, and vitamin E acetate within those cartridges was causing damage to lungs. So we try to pay attention as best we can to vaping and those products, because we know they can be adulterated and they aren't always what they say they are when they sell them. And then oils, or some of you may have heard of these as wax or dabs. These are really concentrated, small doses of THC, and it's usually a one hit, although we've heard people that can get more than one hit off of them. But It's this really high dose or high concentration of THC in a really short amount of time. What's interesting about THC is it's usually a self-titration. So if you're smoking it, you usually take in as much as you want to get the high that you want. However, when you're eating it, you can't self-titrate. So if you eat, if it says eat half of the gummy bear and you eat half of it, and you still don't feel the effects, so you decide to eat the other half, it's sort of all bets are off there, because that's usually when we see some of the really negative side effects, paranoia, tachycardia, things like that. What this all really means is there is no one number or one dose or one concentration for everyone. So when we hear people talking about legal limits for THC, we cringe and get a little upset about that, because we know that one dose for one person is not going to be the same as a dose for someone else. Their reactions are going to be different. If they have other drugs on board, it's going to change metabolic rates and things like that. So there's really, it's really difficult to be able to identify, here is the legal limit for THC for any one person. So I mentioned this earlier, when we do our testing, we look for these three main components. Delta-9 is that parent compound. It's the part of THC that makes people feel high. It has a really short half-life. So that means that once you dose yourself, and I have some graphs to show this, it goes away or dissipates really quickly. So this is why we know that you can't really establish what people would consider a per se or legal limit with THC, because what it is in the time that the person is seen or stopped or the crash occurs, there's too much time that elapses between then and the blood draw. So you can't say what's in the blood is indicative of what it was at an earlier time. The next one there, the 11-hydroxy, that's actually almost as potent or has as much efficacy as the Delta-9. What's really interesting about this, though, is when you smoke marijuana, usually what we'll see is Delta-9 will be around, let's say, 5 nanograms. 11-hydroxy will maybe be 2 or 3 or not there at all. And then we see that carboxy metabolite. When the THC is eaten or an edible is consumed, we actually see the Delta-9 ratio to the 11-hydroxy change. And a lot of times either the 11-hydroxy is the same as the Delta-9 or greater. And again, usually when people take edibles, that's where we start to see some of the paranoia and some of the really negative side effects. So we know there is something to do with the gut and the metabolic pathway when THC products are eaten or consumed that way. That last one is carboxy THC. So that one, we see that one usually in urine. You'll do like a workplace drug testing program, and they'll do urine. That's a really common one. That's what you're looking for in urine. You shouldn't see anything else in urine. You should really only be reporting that carboxy metabolite. But this is one where there's no impairment. All that number, if that's all you have is carboxy and nothing else, all that is telling you is marijuana was consumed. So if that's all you care about, you just want to know compliance, that's a great test in urine for that. But if you want to know recent use in blood, carboxy is not going to tell you that. You're going to have to look for the Delta-9 or the 11-hydroxy. So as I mentioned, and because I'm a nerd to the core, I can't give a talk without giving references. So this is actually a great publication that demonstrates exactly what I was just talking about. That being, we know that after THC consumption, right away, these are concentrations in blood on the left side, and along the bottom is time. So you can see right away after smoking, the concentration, which is that black and gray boxes there, it rises quickly, and then it also very quickly falls. So if you've got somebody that's driving a car and they're in a crash at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, if their blood isn't drawn until 2 hours later, you can see by this graph, that's enough time for that Delta-9 to be a lot lower, or even to the point where we can't detect it anymore. Same thing with, remember, it was Delta-9 and 11-hydroxy. Same thing with 11-hydroxy. That's same profile of a really quick increase and then a pretty quick decline. And then carboxy is that one again that it's a metabolite that's not active. It stays around for a long time. So it can tell us some things in terms of usually a chronic user in blood. If it's greater than 20 nanograms, that's somebody that uses quite a bit because they're building up that metabolite. It basically, Delta-9 gets absorbed into your adipose or fatty tissues and then released back out into the blood as this metabolite. And that process takes time. So that's why over long periods of time, we can still detect the carboxy THC. So we have to be really careful. You know, if somebody wants to know from me, is this a frequent user? I can answer that pretty easily with the carboxy number, but I can't tell you how recent it was. And then this was another article that a colleague of mine did out of Colorado. So Colorado was one of those first states, Washington, Colorado were the first seminal states to legalize THC and then set a legal limit. And in Colorado, it's a 5 nanogram inference, which is basically translates to a legal limit. But you can see there, the majority of the casework from their central laboratory shows that most of their cases are going to be less than 5. Some are less than 2. All of them have impairment documented. So this is again why we have to be really careful with THC. You don't want to punish somebody that's not impaired if they've just used it, but not recently. But you also shouldn't be driving while under the influence. So it's this kind of double-edged sword there. So again, what's the right number? 2, 5? Do we do a number versus an inference, or do we, do we just say 0 tolerance? There is no great answer for this. And this is why when we see states falling in line with decriminalization of marijuana, we don't want them to rest on a number, but we also try to stress to them that look beyond what you're looking at in terms of a legal limit. What else is going to be impacted when it's decriminalized? Are you looking at adolescent education? Are you looking at, if you put a number out there like we have for alcohol, so the legal limit being 0.08, you're actually telling people it's okay to drink and drive, just don't get to that 0.08. And I can pretty much guarantee there is not a soul in Wisconsin that stands in a bar and says, I can't have another one because I think I'm right at a 0.07. No one ever knows what that legal limit is for them. And it's going to carry the same through with THC when it becomes legal in Wisconsin. So we just try to make sure, not taking a stance necessarily either way, but just make sure you understand the downstream effects for when you decriminalize, because we know if you can't collect that sample right when you need to, the number you're measuring is not going to be the same number as when the incident occurred. So CBD and hemp, these are not THC in the way that we think of it. They're part of that cannabis plant, but they're not the same as THC that we've been talking about up until this point for a number of reasons. First of all, those legal products with CBD and hemp, they can contain THC, but less than 0.3%. So if this really is the case and you have a product that is CBD or hemp labeled and it truly has less than 0.3% THC in it, we will not be able to detect Delta-9 in that person. What we're running into now, though, are people that are saying, I swear I bought this from store X. This is the label. It says less than 0.3%. We will refer them to send that product to a laboratory, which then comes back and it's got more than 0.3% THC in it. So we're trying to make sure that people just understand you are risking things if you purchase these products. Just be aware of that. Law enforcement, they have these what we call field kits. So you can take the product and it does like a color change based on what's in the product. And they're always really good for THC until we came up with the CBD and hemp products. And now some of them don't do such a good job of differentiating. So we're actually just telling law enforcement, it's really not worth it to have them tested. If you can't tell between CBD and THC, you're better off having a laboratory do that for you. There's really no regulation or oversight of any of the CBD or the hemp products. You know, like I said, we have so many people that purchase them and tell us or show us the product label, and then we have them have it tested by an independent laboratory, and there are all sorts of other things in those products. We also know, especially with CBD, that there's an adverse effect with some of the other actually prescribed drugs that people are taking, but it's not very well studied. So we just make sure we caution people, if we as scientists aren't really sure if that's going to cause a reaction with your medication, you probably don't know that answer either. So just be careful and be aware. A lot of times we get questions of, hey, there's no way that I was just taking this CBD product and now you have this test result of mine and it says I have Delta-9 THC. That can't be right. There have been several studies out there to show that CBD does not convert into those three main components that we were talking about earlier. It's possible they can convert into other things, but we're not testing for those. And the other thing to keep in mind is, again, we have state-of-the-art equipment. We still struggle and we don't test for everything. When it comes to CBD, there really is no great scientific evidence of medicinal efficacy. So anytime I've had people say, yeah, but when I take CBD, my headache goes away. And my response is, well, it's probably the acetaminophen that's in there or whatever else is in that product. If you think about, let's just say THC, it reacts on these very specific receptors in your brain. So if you think of THC and you have this beanie cap that you wear in the winter and you love it because it covers your whole head and your ears and maybe it down a little bit into your neck and it really covers your head. Think of that as THC as the beanie and that receptor is your head. So THC does a really good job of reacting on these very specific receptors. When we talk about CBD, that's more like maybe the scarf that you wrap around your neck, but it doesn't cover your head. The binding affinity of CBD to those same receptors as THC is just not the same. So when people say they're getting a reaction off of CBD or they're feeling high off of it, that's not what the scientific evidence tells us. So there's likely something else in that product. We also know that there's evidence of some liver injury in terms of metabolic pathway, especially some of these enzymes in your liver that are competing to metabolize other drugs that you're taking. So you risk, again, this co-administration of CBD and your actual prescription medications causing issues there. But we don't know that for sure. So again, this is why we tell people there's some evidence out there to show that you're going to be competing in your liver enzymes with the drugs that you normally would be taking that you need for whatever reason. Do you want to risk by adding in CBD when you really don't know probably why you're taking it or what that effect really will be? We also know that CBD in combination with some central nervous system depressants, you can increase the risk of sedation and drowsiness. So some of the central nervous system depressants, a classic one is alcohol. Some of the anti-anxiety medications that some people are on, like Xanax or Klonopin, things like that. We just want to be really careful again, because you're introducing CBD into this paradigm that you've already created with your prescription medications, and we don't know how the two are going to react. So we just, again, try to make sure when we're talking about THC, CBD, hemp, that you really don't know what's in those products, so you are taking a risk. There is really no quality assurance testing. There's no one laboratory or a handful of laboratories even in this state that will take those products and test them. And there's likely other drugs in those products. We know this because several colleagues of mine have research programs, and in their research programs, they've been having their graduate students collect a lot of the THC, CBD, and hemp products to see what else is in them. And if you look at the pie that you have here on the right where it says AB Pinaka, that's actually a synthetic cannabinoid. And when we start talking about those synthetic cannabinoids, it's sort of all bets are off in terms of effects and toxicity. So it's a really dangerous game to play when you don't really know what you're taking. So what do? we try to educate, and actually the FDA has a pretty good website. So if you just want like a quick, here, go look at this for people, this FDA website is pretty good. They've been able to keep up with things pretty routinely. And so they have all sorts of information of just like what we've talked about today in general with CBD and THC and hemp and things like that. But then also all those other things that we've been talking about in terms of just consumer issues with products and how to make sure you're careful with and just be a smart buyer. Something else that's ridden along the CBD coattails now have been these THC isomers. So when we were talking about THC and I gave you that profile of Delta-9 and then its metabolites or breakdown products, 11-hydroxy and carboxy. Now in our testing, we're starting to see, we've really only seen here in Wisconsin, Delta-8, which the concern here is, this is again, a lot like CBD. We don't know necessarily what it does. We know it's on the same receptor as THC. So just like CBD was the crummy scarf that your Aunt Violet bought you that doesn't really keep you warm. We know Delta-8 is somewhere in between THC and CBD, but we don't exactly know where. So in terms of effects, when I hear people say, oh, I took that Delta-8 product and I was wasted, I don't think it's that as extreme as Delta-9. But I can also say, when we're doing our testing here, we have yet to see a Delta-8 sample minus Delta-9, meaning if they think they bought a Delta-8 product, it had Delta-8 in it, but it also had Delta-9 in it. And the Delta-9 concentration is usually the same or more than the Delta-8. So there again, those are not legal products because they have THC in them. And we know that people are completely unaware because we get a lot of phone calls from people asking, how is it possible that I took Delta-8, but you found Delta-9? Some of those other isomers I have listed, I have colleagues in other states that they're seeing 7, 10, there's a new one, XO, and a few others. So again, this is that revolving door that we talked about really early on, and these novel psychoactive substances that we are trying to stay on top of, but all of this, the THC isomers and the CBD and the hemp is all a downstream effect from when they opened up the Farm Bill Act to allow for people to be able to cultivate and purchase hemp products. Something I pulled that I thought might be interesting to this group is we looked at our driving population. And so this is just teens. This doesn't necessarily mean it's the true definition of adolescent. It's just, this was the cleanest way we could to break down our data. So it's true teens, 16 to 19. And we wanted to look at THC concentrations and numbers and just see how many of our drivers that are teenagers do we see THC in them. So just standing alone, this doesn't tell you a whole lot other than, you see that number along the left side, 1,000 is where we've capped it. So you can see there's been an increase in the green bar, especially in 2017, but it kind of, ebbs and flows a little bit. It's a little more helpful when we put this in context of all the non-teen cases. So you can see, yes, it's no surprise that we would see THC in our teen drivers because that actually tracks with all of our other cases. THC is the most common drug, but really when we put it up against the adult population, and this is not normalized by number, but just by year, you can see though we still see far more users that are above the age of 19 than we do the teens. So it's not to say we're writing off the teens. There's definitely an issue there and we see it in that population. But just to give you some reference, we see it far more in the older or greater than teen population. Something else that we have been trying to keep an eye on, but it's tough because you really don't want to dose teenagers with marijuana and then see how they react or, check different scans and things like that because we know there's a risk there. So we do have some modeling that we look at in terms of rats, which, every time I say this to people, they shake their head yes, we're nothing like rats, but we have very similar metabolic pathways. That's why a lot of times we'll use rats for drug research, because they often have the same first and second pass metabolism as we do. So we know that with rats, there is an effect, and it can result in the underpinning of that cognitive deficit that we often hear about with teenagers that were chronic as teenagers. And then later in life, they tend to have short-term memory issues. Sometimes it's a lack of appropriate serotonin, so there's some depression. There is a hypothesis that if you were an adolescent and you used THC, you're opening that door or that gateway to other drugs. We don't really know that for sure. That's definitely a hypothesis out there, but we also know that today's adolescence is very different than what it was 10, 20 years ago, where we are more likely to prescribe medications to adolescents than we ever were before, whether that's ADHD medications or anything else. So we always know there's going to be some sort of long-term effect with whatever we do in adolescence. It's just really hard to study cognition in adolescence to see if chronic use for THC at a young age affects brain development. There's a lot of information and studies out there that point to it does, because the brain is still developing even through those teen years. So you have all this information now. I always feel like I'm kind of dumping stuff on people and running away, especially when we're not in the same room. Just always remember, cannabis has continuously been our most common drug of abuse, right behind alcohol, and it's always in conjunction with alcohol. It's really rare now for us to see just cannabis and absolutely nothing else. A lot of what we go to trial on today versus what it was 20 years ago are polysubstance. We, again, since we don't do drug testing on every single sample that crosses our threshold, we took a sample population of cases where the blood alcohol was greater than 0.1, and we did not perform drug testing. So we took 1,000 of those cases, and we hired an intern, and we had her run those with our drug testing workflow to see, how many instances of those 1,000 cases where we know it's alcohol is primary, what else is there? 60% of those cases in that group were also positive for THC. So we absolutely know when their sample comes here and we're reporting it out, if we triage testing based on blood alcohol concentration, we are not giving all the information people need to appropriately assess that person. And we understand 100% that that's a deficit and we don't like it, but we don't have the resources to do all testing on everything. We also know that those isomers are really presenting a very different and unique issue, especially because so many of those products, even before the isomers came on the scene, we learned with CBD products and hemp products that what they're reporting is in that product really is not, what those people are taking. And so we just want to make sure that, especially if they're in a compliance program and they should be drug-free, you always want to caution people that even though the product says it doesn't contain other things, that it may not necessarily be true. So that's why we try really hard. This is why trainings like this we feel are very important, just to make sure that this is on your radar and you're aware of what's going on and what we're seeing in our casework. So if there are any questions, I can take them at this time.
Awesome. Well, I want to say thank you, Amy. But yeah, we have about 15 minutes. If anybody has any questions, feel free to just ask. There hasn't been any questions in the chat or anything. So, feel free to fire away. And if not, then I'll do some closing regards and stuff, and then we'll be on our way. I guess I have a quick question, Amy, if that's all right. So you said that in the Delta-8 products that we're seeing, they are still testing positive most of the time for Delta-9. How,
Yes.
I guess, how does that even work if technically those products are supposed to have, less than 0.03% of that THC in order to even be sold or legal per se in, the States?
Yep. So that's a great question. If you can solve it, Sam, you will solve most of the world's problems. So we know this not only from what we see in Wisconsin, but countrywide. And most of these products are labeled as herbal supplement or something to circumvent any sort of compliance or quality assurance testing. So that's why, you can sell anything that says that it's herbal on it with very little oversight or regulation, and that's how they get away with it.
We do have a question in chat that just asked, how backed up is the state lab?
Painfully. Last year I had 2 people retire, which I was expecting and I was coming to grips with. But then I also lost one to, they just want to stay home with the family. And then the other 2 went to a private lab. So we right now are probably about 9 months behind, but we've just hired 3 and we are in the process of interviewing for 2 more. So it's going to be painful for a little bit, but eventually we'll get back up to speed.
Any other questions? All right then. So again, I just want to say thank you, Amy. I want to echo my comments from before. It was super awesome, super useful, very interesting. I guess my audio cut out before, so I just want to say this. We are going to send out a post survey for everyone that registered or everyone that showed up here. It's going to be super short. We appreciate if you can fill it out. If you fill it out, actually, you will be entered into a little raffle for a $25 gift card. So just want to make sure that you guys are aware of that. Otherwise, like I said, if there's no other questions, feel free to log off. I'm probably going to hang around for a little bit, but thank you all for showing up and being here. And again, thank you, Amy, for the talk. So the recording we're going to post on our YouTube channel, the Addiction Resource Council YouTube channel. All right, Lindsay, I only have the option to leave, so I'm guessing you have the option to end the meeting for everybody. So do you want to go ahead and end the meeting then?